there are buildings, passive buildings, achieving those targets right now in use, as in recorded consumption, not just design. It's great to know that we had the recipe, but it does mean as a profession, there's an awful lot of work to be done in terms of upskilling.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. You can also check out our Reimagined Buildings YouTube channel for some great inspiration for both building new or renovating. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast.
Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. And we've got Zach on the line from Seattle. How are you going, Zach?
I'm well, thank you.
And we're also joined this week by Ilka back in Philadelphia. How are you, Ilka?
I'm pretty good. Thank you.
And great to have a interview from your recent trip. A little far from home, from Ireland. Fantastic to have some comments and some interviews, some insights from that part of the world, which really excited to get into. So before we do that, Zach, you want to do some shout outs?
Absolutely. So a big thank you to the sponsors that make the podcast possible. So our founding sponsors are 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingwe Architects, Glavel, Minutair, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwool North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Our champion sponsors are Bewizo, Gradient, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, PH Air Seal, Proseco, and Source 2050. And a big shout out to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
So, Ilka, how did you end up in Galway and talking to Helena?
Well, it was actually a family trip because my sister-in-law lives in Kinvara, which is very close to Galway. And it was basically very much a coincidence that I even connected with Helena because we walked by this house all the time that was right in the neighborhood. And it was a friend and neighbor of my sister-in-law. And it was just built by Helena's firm. Found out that she was one of the big passive house architects in the area. And this friend was nice enough to give me Helena's direct number. So I just reached out and was very happy to talk to her and also see one of her projects.
So you spotted what looked like a passive house, what you suspected might be, and then found out indeed it was.
Yeah. The one that we walked by was actually not fully certified, but since it was built by Helena, you could definitely tell that there are all the passive house principles in place to build a very energy efficient home.
But they do look stunning. So we'll put some links in the show notes to some of the houses that we're talking about because it's a pretty incredible part of the world. And you talk a bit about in the interview about how they look out and make most of the views there. So let's get into it. Here is your interview with Helena.
Welcome to the Passive House Accelerator podcast, Helena. You are the founder, principal architect, and creative director of Helena McElmeel Architects, correct?
Yes, we're an architectural practice based in the west of Ireland in Galway city. And I suppose our work is really based in the west of Ireland. So it's about 10 years ago. Just a little bit over, we established the practice, and it's we're up to a team now of 9, and doing a lot of work in the passive house space. And increasingly so over the last few years, we've seen increased interest in that area. So,
can you tell us a little bit about your personal background first?
Yes. I studied architecture at the time. You had very limited choices in terms of schools of architecture in Ireland. So I studied architecture in Dublin, in what is now TU Dublin, Technical University Dublin. after I spent, I suppose, a lot of time from graduate, I've been mostly working in Ireland since graduating. So I didn't really take maybe the opportunity in my younger years to travel. But I have worked, and most of that time has been in the West. Back in, I suppose, how I'm in the passive house space and how the practice has evolved, I suppose, with a sustainability emphasis probably comes from a decision to do a master's in the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales back in 2008, 2009. And I suppose that probably, in terms of my professional development, was probably the biggest single shift or move that led to where we are now and the kind of work we do now. It was it's a fabulous course and it fully immerses you in all elements of sustainability. So it's a master's in architecture, advanced energy and environmental studies. And I suppose that's where my my particular interest in passive house probably developed during that period. Which is fabulous to have the opportunity to research, and the course is structured really well, or I'm not sure how it's structured now, but at that time structured very well. It was a residential element for a week, and you would be fully immersed, and you could pick, you could look at your research and your assignments, and your work could be driven by your agendas and your particular interests. So it really, you had people from all different disciplines involved in that. So I think looking back, that was the single biggest move. And then I went on to do the passive house training, certified passive house designer. I'm trying to think, that's probably about 2011, 2012. And I suppose we haven't looked back since. So in the team here in the office, we have 3 certified designers and 1 on their way. 2 certification this year and another to do the course this autumn. So by the end of the year, hopefully we'll have 5. So,
well, that's very exciting. I mean, it's always inspiring to hear that an educational choice actually led you in a very positive, sustainable direction. Can you elaborate a little on your local climate? Tell us about what the west of Ireland is like.
Well, the climate can be challenging. We've had I suppose the biggest single issue here is the rain and the wind-driven rain. So as architects, a lot of your challenge can be, that's your priority, is keeping that out of the building. So regardless of passive or whatever type of building you're building, that's probably the biggest single challenge. The west of Ireland has a very high level of exposure, severe kind of exposure in terms of wind-driven rain, which is, does influence a lot of our detailing and the emphasis on the, I suppose, the robustness of materials and that horizontal rain can be managed. So from I suppose weathering is a particular challenge. It also, I suppose, in terms of passive house, there's a sense, I think it probably influences, or it maybe makes more people very committed or difficult to change their minds in terms of traditional construction, as we would call it here, which would be concrete block-based construction. I suppose it does add to maybe a fear around other alternative forms of construction, and often those more sustainable, maybe like the use of timber framed buildings, for example. So there is a little bit, sometimes you can, both in the industry and certain developers or clients, there is a little bit of they feel it's tried and tested, and there is that little bit of sometimes nervousness around the use of alternatives to our traditional, inverted commas, kind of build materials. We are seeing on the positive side that we have in the Galway and the Western region, we have a number of very good, it's a good network in terms of contractors and construction teams and businesses that can support, that are, I suppose, changing that mindset in terms of the amount of buildings that that we have exemplars now of buildings that have been around for decades of the more novel forms of construction. So it's easier to influence people's thinkings in terms of maybe lower embodied carbon type options when they're building. But I suppose at the minute, the biggest single thing really is, the other, I suppose, thing in Galway would be, it is that little bit milder as well. So, when we're modelling our passive houses, you will see differences. I know Ireland's a relatively small country, but there is still a significant difference in terms of the inland. So on our coastal sites, we will have slightly milder conditions during the winter than some of the sites an hour or so inland. So it's just another, I suppose that influences it a little bit also.
So going back to the climate, I mean, when I was just there, and it was actually my first time in Ireland, I was just amazed by the weather, because I learned very quickly that you can never, ever leave your house without a rain jacket, that it can look beautifully, and then 2 minutes later, there could be a downpour. So that was surprising. And then it stops again, and then it rains again. So in my mind, I was really wondering, how do you keep everything dry, even your assemblies, right? Because when we do hydrothermal analysis here in our climate, it always shows that at least during the summer, you can always dry out. But it seems like that's a little bit more challenging in your climate. And then I was also wondering, just looking at the more traditional houses that were around, I was surprised about the lack of big overhangs, until I heard that, because of the horizontal rain, maybe it doesn't even make sense to have big overhangs. So there are just certain things that were particular to the climate that were just very educating for me. So in terms of traditional or vernacular architecture, not just building materials, but the shape of the houses that have been built according to the climate, is that something that you still pick up in your modern designs, or how do you look at that?
I suppose a lot of our work would be taking, we're looking at what's around us, and the context is particular in the West. We don't see, you probably saw no brick or very little brick, for example, Ilka, when you were over. The materials we're dealing with, renders. There may have been stone buildings in the past, or now typically there will be a concrete block build. There may be a render coating to the outside of it. The edges you mentioned about overhangs, and and they would have been similar type materials that we would have seen in the traditional cottages, which would have been rendered. But typically those or two-story farmhouses and outbuildings, and the outbuildings are great fun to reference, because we have interesting roof forms, and they kind of evolve you can get quite an eclectic mix of forms with those. So they are great fun to reference. The one thing that is quite, you mentioned the overhangs, and that is a particular, we see a very minimal overhangs, almost no eaves type details to those vernacular buildings. So I suppose a lot of the work that we do draws on those kind of details and ideas. So you don't see a huge number of overhangs in our buildings as well, because a lot of them are in rural or close to that kind of, you're looking for that vernacular reference, or those or they're in a rural context. So you're drawing on those kind of details, ideas from the buildings of the past.
Yeah, and I guess you don't really need a lot of shading, right? For us, a lot of times the overhangs just provide shading in the summer, but I think you're happy to get some solar gains.
It's still a challenge, I think, and I suppose what we're seeing over the past couple of months kind of heightens, everyone's awareness in terms of the need to review and consider overheating in our designs. I suppose is one of the benefits that, almost every project in every house, at least in this office, is run through the passive house planning package. So we can kind of see very quickly if we're going to, what are our overheating risk, and adapt our designs to do that. So that's but you're just wondering, when you see over the last I suppose this summer and I suppose from a climate perspective, the challenges in Europe, and we had a bit of a heat wave, I think, just before you joined us, Ilka, a month or two ago in Ireland. Also, we do have sunshine sometimes, and so I suppose we're very aware of it, and we're kind of, even it's a live discussion here in the office, and as to whether we need to, is the stress testing that we're undertaking through the PHPP, should we be doing, might need to be reviewed or be more strenuous, or building in more safety into those. So it's not, we do have overhangs on elements on some projects, but it mightn't be necessarily a roof overhang. So you might recess windows or use other ways of creating some protection. A lot of the buildings, for example, that you visited, Ilka, those particular houses. Obviously, the client and the developer, our client on that project, was very keen to maximise the windows and the views, and it was a real challenge on that project to try and balance the overheating with the client's, requirement for very large windows with beautiful views out over Galway Bay. So, we were looking very carefully at our glazing specification. We're looking and managed to negotiate a little bit of reduction in the window sizes with the client. But a lot, I suppose, we do have a lot of housing, on site, similar sites with similar challenges of balancing that overheating with a requirement to make the most of the views. We're lucky to have some, other passive houses with, similar views over the bay or maybe up out to Connemara, and there's a challenge in that, so it's not to be underestimated. Even in the Irish context, it's still an issue, and I suppose it will become increasingly more of an issue as we deal with the impacts of climate change.
Yeah. And then you also, when we visited the Furbo Passive House, Owen talked about the roll down sun shading as well. I mean, that's something that you're implementing.
We are, I suppose. We tend to design it with that, to meet the requirement without relying on the mitigation or adaptation, as in the layering in of other, we're designing to the passive house overheating limit within that, and then we add the we use the shades or roller blinds or nighttime ventilation. We add those in once as an extra safety factor on the design. So we aim to be below the standard and then look at mitigation to bring it as our safety factor. So yes, a lot of houses that we would design would have integrated blind systems that, those are automated as well to allow for an element of control, even when the homeowner or the occupant may not be there. So we are using that, but it's more a supplement to an extra layer of safety, I suppose, on the design from an overheating perspective.
And I'm curious about how well Passive House is known or adopted in your area. Are your clients coming to you because they've heard about Passive House and they want it, or do they come to you just because they want a house and then you kind of lead them toward Passive House?
I suppose I kind of started the first Passive House we constructed here in the office was 10 years ago, and we built that project. So it was one of our early projects. And over the first few years, I suppose we found if people came to you day one, like that client, for example, had a copy of Passive House Plus on there. You may have heard of Jeff Colley's publication. They had that on the window in their conservatory the first day I met them. So it was an indication of some commitment to passive from the outset. But I think that's, if clients mention, we found that generally for a lot of our passive builds, the clients have mentioned it very early in the process. But that was, I suppose, for the first, up until the last 2 years, we found over the past 2 years a little bit different, as in, I think people are, we have a lot of clients spending an awful lot of money on a project, and we believe that passive is the best way to build. And I suppose we're finding that easier to, educate clients around that, and they're generally coming with us on it. A lot of the projects, almost the bulk of our residential work now is designed to the passive standard, and a lot of it proposed for certification also, which is great. So I think we're finding it increasingly easy to bring clients along with us on the passive route, not just the people who are aware of it when they phoned us. So we are getting a mixture of clients. In terms of passive in the west of Ireland, there's not, it's a fairly limited number of passive house designers or design professionals delivering houses to the passive standard to this side of the country. And we are lucky, though we're supported well by, we have some very good contractors who have really helped us get started in passive and deliver our first passive buildings. And I suppose are, make it easier to design and deliver passive buildings when there are contractors there in the West that can meet the airtightness requirements, that understand the thermal bridging, that get it and are very skilled at it. Like, for example, Niall Dolan of Green Tech Eco Homes has been a fabulous ally over the last 10 years in terms of helping us deliver passive and complex passive houses through his skills and knowledge. We're currently building a number of passive buildings with Emmett Nee of Long Life Structures. a really great timber frame system. And again, they're delivering, they're making it easy for us to meet those air tightness requirements, which are not they make it easy when it's not easy, and it's through their skills and experience and commitment to passive that allows us to design buildings to passive. Our contractors like them. There are other very good contractors as well, but they're two that particularly come to mind.
So how about the rest of Ireland? How is passive house? Is it well known and is it well adopted, or is it a standard that's still flying a little bit under the radar?
About 15 years ago, I kind of thought it felt like passive was going to become very mainstream, and I suppose it's still a little bit niche. I don't think it hasn't become. There's a lot higher level of awareness around passive and what it is and what it means or what it doesn't mean. But it's still a little bit niche. It's not, like, put it this way, if we're looking at the architectural practices in Galway, in the region in which we're based, there's still very few others delivering passive buildings. So that gives an indication. I think I'm involved in the Passive House Association of Ireland, and I suppose the key objective is to kind of encourage, as in help promote and help promote passive and help, upskill the construction, our teams and our partners in the industry around the requirements for passive, or how to deliver passive buildings. We have a lot of companies that can help us deliver, in construction, manufacturers, suppliers. The network is there, the systems are there, but it feels like as we I think there's still. Passive is to meet the kind of buildings we need to be building over the next 10 years, and to start building, reacting properly to the climate challenge or the climate change challenge. I can't see any other way if we're looking at the performance of our buildings in terms of their energy consumption. I can't see any other way that this is, the recipe. We have the recipe. So I don't completely committed that this is what we need to do, whether we call it passive or not. It's passive or that equivalent, whether you brand it that or not. But that's the kind of building we need to build.
Yeah, and I feel like in particular with your climate, with all the wind, people are already used to a lot of the materials that are being used to build airtight, right? Like everyone's using membranes, smart membranes. It's not a new material. And that's one of the biggest materials that make a passive house, correct?
Yeah, I suppose the wind tightness and the air tightness, regardless of what you want to call the building, if we can get to that, designing for that level of performance, you hit the nail on the head. Yeah, the technology and the principles are there. It's maybe it's a branding or a rebranding exercise that's needed. Maybe there is. I suppose it's about then the skills to deliver them. Do we have enough certified passive house designers in Ireland? I don't know. Maybe we don't. I know there's an increasing number of courses available, which is great to see. So it's also, so I don't know if the industry is fully, there's still some fear, I suppose, in terms of construction. For example, the houses in Furbo that you visited, Ilka, those contractors, the builders, are all the team, the construction team. They all came locally from the Gaeltacht area in Connemara, the bulk of them. And none of them had built a passive building before. They did not, they came into this not with a very limited awareness of air tightness or thermal bridging. But they invested, they did the training, and they really committed to it. Now they get it and they can see the benefits of it. But it was, a steep learning curve for that team to be able to deliver. So there is about capacity and I suppose a little bit of fear. It's very difficult for a contractor to commit to a 0.6 level of air tightness if they've never done it before, and the risk in a building contract to do that. So you can see why it's just every house that's delivered and every new contractor involved in the delivery of that house just increases the capacity of the industry to deliver. It's I suppose in Ireland we're seeing 600 plus units being constructed to the passive house standard. In Dublin is by the Land Development Agency, a state a state agency tasked with delivering housing at scale. And I suppose that it's really positive to see things like that happening. A commitment to passive at that scale and that level in Dublin. We also then, I suppose, positives in terms of, what we're hearing from Scotland in terms of their requirement for passive or passive type buildings to be introduced next year. Is that correct? So I suppose these are all positives. And but at the minute, I suppose every house delivered and every, construction team that are involved in delivering, every new team involved helps us, take some of the fear out of passive and it will help make it more accessible.
Definitely that spreading of the education by working on a project is a great way to get the training and the messaging out. And you mentioned a Giltacht area where the Furbo is. Can you elaborate on what that is?
Furbo is in an area. It's called the Gaeltacht. So it's an area where the Irish language is the primary language, as in the everyday language used. I'm not the world's much. I'm not a fabulous Irish speaker. I did a little bit at school, which we're all required to do in Ireland, is to study Irish at school. So the Gaeltacht area, the Furbo housing is located in a little village in the Gaeltacht. That the contractors would arrive to site and the construction team would be chatting away in Irish, some of which you could not follow. So God knows what they were saying about. maybe some of us on the architects, maybe were safer. We didn't understand some of it. But if that particular project, for example, there's a requirement in the planning that the majority of the residential units are reserved for Irish speakers, so that you have to effectively do an exam to occupy the houses there to demonstrate a competence that you can converse and have conversations in Irish if you're going to be a resident. So it's quite a requirement. But I think it's 3 out of the 4 units were required have that condition attached to them, so that the occupants have to sit effectively an interview to demonstrate their Irish language skills. So but that's I suppose there are a number located the west and there are a number of Gaeltacht areas throughout Ireland, but again they concentrated mostly on the western side of the country.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting to hear about that, that it's actually integrated in basically the building permit, right?
It is, yeah.
There has to be Irish speakers. And my brother-in-law is actually an Irish teacher in Kinvara. So we had a lot of conversations with him about that Gaeltacht area. So it's super interesting.
How many houses are there in this passive house development?
Yeah. So there are 4 units in this 4-bedroom homes. So they're on the higher end of the market. And we have another application currently on board Planala, which is our kind of a planning appeals board in Ireland, which is still under consideration for a terrace of units to the front to form a street onto the village. Because if you remember, Ilka, the village is kind of quite fragmented. There's very little sense of street in Furbo, and we have something still under consideration by the Planning Appeals Board to try and establish a frontage that would create a bit of streetscape in the village. So we're kind of interested to see how that appeal works out. But there is a proposed second phase to the development to kind of tie it back into the village and the streetscape.
So do you ever work on retrofits, or is your practice entirely new construction?
We're all going to be working only on retrofits, or almost only on retrofits over the next decade, I think. It's funny, we have another project nearby, just beside, just a little bit closer to the beach in Furbo, and that project is it's not under construction yet. It's in the planning process, but that project will be an EnerFit. So we have modelled that. And so that's a proposed EnerFit project nearby. It just happens to be in the same village. So we have quite a bit of retrofit work on, but very much, again, we're modelling those through. We're using our passive house planning package. And And we have a number live at the moment at various stages. Some are getting ready for construction, some are at the earlier stages, but we have quite a few at the minute that are proposed EnerFit projects. So it would be excited to deliver some of these, get these certified and through the we're at the various different stages of design in those projects, but it'd be great to get some of them delivered over the next, I suppose, 12 to 18 months.
Very exciting.
Yeah. So are there any other interesting projects that we would like to talk about?
Yeah, we have we've built a number of, we have a lot of passive homes in different locations certified in mostly in County Galway. We have, I suppose, our other area of work. We do various building types, but another area of particular interest over the past couple of years has been a public realm work. So I know it's not really linked to our passive work, but we kind of really enjoy that, I suppose, engaging with working with communities and teams to look at maybe enhancement plans for towns and strategies for amenity areas. So that's another strand to the work in the office here, which is kind of exciting also. It's a different scale, but that engaging with communities, we really enjoy that. And we work with the One Planet Limby framework bioregional. So we use that as an assessment, a tool to make us work harder to maximize the opportunities in terms of sustainability and biodiversity in our public realm projects. We find it makes us try harder and work harder to integrate and just to do better from a climate and biodiversity impact or opportunities in projects, the public realm projects in mostly towns and villages. We're involved with you mentioned existing buildings, and we're working with a team. We've been appointed by the Irish Architecture Foundation under their Reimagine programme to look at how we can convert vacant to vibrant in terms of vacant buildings in Tuam. It's a large town in County Galway. So we're currently working with Creative Places Tuam, an arts agency, and Niall O'Cleary, an architect based in the east of Ireland. So we're working together with the community in Tuam and the local authority and other key stakeholders there to come up with strategies to get more of their buildings back into use in their town centre. So I suppose those kind of, it all links back to that vacancy in existing buildings that you maybe referred to, but they're kind of interesting projects and they're kind of challenging. But again, there's a lot of benefit to be had, and it's an enjoyable process, projects of that nature.
Can I go back to the EnerFit projects that you're working on?
Mm-hmm.
Are those, I assume they're all like masonry type structures, right?
They are actually, yes, they are. The existing structures are. So typically some of them will have elements, some are older, and they, like we have one that is cast in situ concrete, so but maybe 1920s building, 1930s perhaps. We have some stone, and we have a lot of block work, be it earlier 1960s, 70s of kind of profile block work houses for deep retrofits.
Are you generally insulating from the exterior or from the interior, or is there no pattern?
It depends on the building. So the masonry builds, typically we would be externally insulating those. So where we have concrete block builds, where we have, we're working with, we have some conservation projects also. I'm just thinking to mind, but where we're layering, where we're dealing with stone and breathability is a significant issue, and we have some projects where we're using hemp-based insulation, hempcrete type products. We have, what else do we have? I'm trying to think of the solutions. We have the cork lime type insulating systems. We have wood fiber used internally. So a lot of those, it's very, any internally insulated buildings are where it's generally breathability and the hygrothermals informing those decisions, or there might be a conservation element to the exterior of the building. That's a consideration. But we are, typically we are a combination of both really. It's very much led by the building. Maybe it's conservation and breathability as kind of drivers of those decisions.
Great, very interesting work.
Yeah, very, very impressive. So no wonder that you actually received the Building and Architect of the Year award. Congratulations to that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we received an award in over the years. I suppose we received a sustainability award 5 or 6 years ago for one of our first passive houses. And then this year we won the Social Impact Award in the Building and Architect of the Year Awards. And that was for our work in Ennistimon, which is a beautiful town in County Clare. I don't know if you managed to get there, Ilka, on your travels, but so we worked with the town team in Ennistimon and Clare County Council, the local authority, to develop an enhancement plan for the town. So I suppose we received the award for our work in Ennistimon on that particular project. Great clients. We have in Ireland we have last year they introduced a policy called our Town Centre First policy, which looks at the regeneration of towns throughout the country. And as part of that policy, the establishment of town teams, we were appointed. We were doing that project. We were actively working on the project when the policy came out, but we were effectively almost a version of what that policy was. That project was almost a preemptor or a pilot in a way. Looking back now, though, it wasn't an official pilot, but the Clare County Council had engaged with a town team, which is now this recommended strategy under the Town Centre First policy, where you partner with the community to develop the plans for your town. So a great team, really, really enjoyable process. We had everyone at that table and in every meeting was fully committed to the project and everything was constructive. It was really, and it was nice to pick up the award as much for the team and the client behind it, the Ennistimon Town Team and Clare County Council, given everyone's kind of commitment. It's nice to see it recognised. If we're looking at passive in the future for Ireland, I'm the chairperson of the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland's Sustainability Task Force. And a lot of our work over the past 2 years has been the development and I suppose the helping to educate and the professions and architects in relation to the RIAI 2030 Climate Challenge. The Climate Challenge is a design for performance standard that we've created working with the Royal Institute of British Architects to set out a vision and metrics for architects to basically build better now and to build ahead or beyond regulation. It looks at the operational energy requirement of buildings, as in how we should be designing our buildings now to the targets we should have in place for any new buildings that we're delivering between now and 2030. So it looks at the operational, it looks at the embodied carbon, the water consumption of our buildings, and it's looking at biodiversity and health and well-being metrics, things like overheating or radon or indoor air quality. So we are, our focus here in the office is we're trying to get increasing numbers of buildings delivered to meet those particular metrics. And we think passive is probably the easiest way to get in terms of the operational energy requirements set out in the climate challenge. It's probably the easiest. It's the easiest way to get there in terms of meeting those particular targets of 35 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year for residential buildings, which includes both the operational requirements of the heating and the hot water, the services in the building, plus the actual consumption of appliances or the occupants, other uses within the building. So it's kind of it's called a challenge for a reason, but it's great to see passive as a way of getting to meet that. That's probably also influencing our current shift to increasing amount of timber framed passive builds. So we're working. Currently, we have 3 passive projects at construction stage, and they are all timber-based. So, and we're kind of moving. So, our next bank of certified passive house projects will be trying to meet the embodied carbon requirements targets set out in the climate challenge also. So, we're kind of a lot of upskilling, a lot of work going on to create new details, new standards, new ways of doing things. But we are, because we're kind of keen to, we know we have the operational in hand with our passive house design. So now we're getting our embodied carbon and the impact its buildings are having, trying to tackle that. So that's our kind of, a lot of the focus of our work here presently is, trying to do an awful lot better in terms of the embodied carbon impact of our buildings.
Right. It's great to build from passive house.
We looked at the metrics, I'm involved in the task force. So we prepared some CPD for the profession, looking at like a briefing in relation to how you might deliver to the climate challenge metrics. And when I started to look at our projects, very quickly we could see that we looked at some post-occupancy and in-use data we had from projects and some of my colleagues in the Passive House Association. So, there are buildings, passive buildings, achieving those targets right now in use, as in recorded consumption, not just design, the modelled anticipated consumption of those buildings. So it's just, it's great to know that we had the recipe, but it does mean as a profession, there's an awful lot of work to be done in terms of upskilling. And it's a huge opportunity for Passive House as well in Ireland. If this is what, we're setting out as, where we need to go, we can get there much more quickly if we can work with, build on the passive house in Ireland. So it's anyway, it's exciting, and it meant we had a little bit less work. We at least we only have to focus on the embodied carbon element of it, and we're kind of comfortable with the operational side of it.
Mm-hmm.
What's helpful about the RIAI climate challenge is that it sets out, where the profession thinks we need to be. And so if you're building a building in 2030, it means anything on your drawing board over the next couple of years has to be to that standard. There's no point working to the 2025, designing to that, and there's different steps in this. It's a step, there's a 2025 standard and a 2030 standard. But with the 2030 standard, you have, it's great to say clients like our passive buildings, we've been building to the 2030, this kind of target. We've been building passive buildings to that for the last 10 years in this office. So it's kind of, confidence building. Our clients who did invest in passive now can see that they have, that they were ahead of the game, and clients that are building a new house now, or particularly their homes, it's a lot easier. You're saying it's not just us who thinks it's good. The Royal Institute of Architects in Ireland and the Royal Institute of British Architects have also concurred that this is how we need to build by 2030, and we can do it now. So it's a little bit, it's helpful in terms of framing, a passive house as a good way to build.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Helena. I really appreciate, and it's so interesting to hear about what's going on in Galway and the Western region there.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. And I will definitely be back at some point. So don't be surprised if I reach out again.
We look forward to it. Happy to show you whatever, maybe an Enerfit next time.
Great interview, Ilka. I really enjoyed that. Really great to reach out and talk to our friends and colleagues in that part of the world. What was the weather like when you were there?
Rainy every single day. I to be honest, I didn't really expect that, but that's what it was. It looked beautiful outside, and then it just poured all of a sudden. So we just got used to taking rain jackets with us all the time. And basically the wind, it was so windy too, that it was just about layering clothes. And every day you would basically put on and take off 3 layers. That's how the temperature swing was, and the rain and the sun. But, it didn't hold us back. I think once you commit to it, it's just what it is.
Just a bit of a vision. You're kind of right on the North Atlantic Ocean there, a little bit of an inlet to exactly where the village was, but you're pretty exposed there on the west coast of Ireland. I imagine to some pretty ferocious weather, which also would make for some pretty dramatic and stunning scenery.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think you could tell with the houses that she built, they always took a lot of advantage of all these very dramatic views with very large window openings.
Yeah, I mean, I said at the intro that you sort of walked past and spotted these as potentially passive houses, but I don't mean to imply that they're by any means boring and small windows. You know, the views, and you know, I think one side of them is nearly a huge amount of glass. Is floor to ceiling windows that look out onto the water. They're quite stunning. So they're kind of a nice mix of, they look quite cozy, but you get a very strong sense of being connected to that environment that's close by.
That was definitely something that I noticed walking through the neighborhood, especially with all the newer buildings, that there was always this view basically through the entry door out the back of the building. Then there was also something about corner windows. Every new house had a big corner window. So that was very, very popular.
Interesting, because I mean, you talked a lot about the horizontal rain. And that takes some skill and some pretty good quality windows to make those watertight.
Yeah.
Zach, what were your thoughts?
Well, looking at the images on her website of the houses she was just discussing, made me feel right at home. It looks very much like the Pacific Northwest, although it does sound like the horizontal rain is more intense than we experience here in the Puget Sound. Probably a little bit more like the Washington coast or the western coast of Vancouver Island. But I was really interested to hear, and this is something that passive house practitioners definitely deal with here in the Northwest, is that even though it can be, you know, cold and dreary and rainy and stuff, and you do want to capture those views. Often those views are western facing, so that means that you're exposed to a lot of solar gain in the afternoon, so that theme of, you know, really being careful and planful about addressing the possibility of overheating was, that came through loud and clear. And I liked her approach of first dialing in the comfort level, the thermal comfort levels with PHPP, and then adding on the extra protection of the exterior shades, and, you know, basically building in some safety. I think this is top of mind for a lot of people in the passive house community, both that it's really important to look at the potential for overheating and to analyze that very carefully. And secondly, that we know that we get these weird heat domes now, and we know that we're warming in general. So building in more aspects of the building that can battle that heat is important during those, for those weird events.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely raises that question about how far you can go with PHPP in terms of accurately modeling that heat, but then also, doing something about it in your design to look at that. And I know that it's something that obviously we're thinking about quite a lot in Australia and New Zealand. It's very interesting to hear people in colder climates think about that, because they are experiencing these warmer conditions. And I think, that was something that people were sensitive to when you were there, Ilka, because they had just experienced some pretty warm weather.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to the modeling side, because I do a lot of modeling, and it is really hard to capture or to predict the overheating in WUFI. And I think it's the same in PHPP, where you basically assume a whole envelope without any interior walls or any floors, and you're just kind of assuming that the temperature is equalized everywhere. So that's how the energy model calculates your heating and cooling demand and loads, but it doesn't necessarily look at that one room on the southern corner that has walls and big windows, and that might be prone to overheating. So it's quite difficult. And what I started to do is to say, it's great to really have all the solar gains, but you have to be able to control them. Otherwise, you might be really facing a lot of overheating, and that is a problem these days.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I think also there's that more and more it's becoming more and more common to have cooling, and heat pump technology makes that easier to add cooling as well, as a safety, even in regions where we haven't had cooling in the past. Something a lot of people are moving to in Seattle.
Yeah, and the houses that I visited in Ireland, I'm pretty sure they didn't have cooling. So they really need to be able to control the solar gains that they do have.
Yeah. Really pleased that you brought up, or Helena brought up, the RIAI 2030 Climate Challenge. Perhaps we can also put a link to that. And that looks, I mean, you can have a look at the detail, and we just had a quick dive into that to look at some of the numbers that are in there. But the bottom line is that, as Helena's finding, that Passive House offers the easiest way for them, or definitely a viable pathway of achieving some of those challenges in there, particularly around the operational energy use. She mentioned 35 kilowatt hours per square metre, which is pretty. I mean, that's total operational energy. So that's not easy to achieve that without, especially if you're not doing Passive House. So it's great to have that in place, and I really like that philosophy of having a target, having some maybe 2025 targets and 2030 targets, but also realizing that if you're designing now, today in 2023, then it makes a lot more sense to be thinking about likely codes and targets that are going to be around 2030 than just in 2025, because if you're just doing the concept designs for something right now, that building might not be completed until 2025, and that's only the very beginning of the lifespan of that building. So I think that's really useful to have these sort of future thinking targets and codes and design regulations well sort of locked in advance.
I just think it's just really, I mean, it was amazing, all the organizations and everything that she is involved in, and that she always comes back to Passive House, that is something that fits in well, whatever they do. And, it doesn't matter if it's addressing a whole town center or sustainability in general. Looking at Passive House is definitely one way to really lower the operational carbon. But what's also important is that now everyone is starting to really look at the embodied carbon as well, and that's something that she's very involved in, as you could hear.
Yeah. It's definitely, and she's pretty active in that RIAI herself.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Any other final comments from you, Zach?
Well, I think, Ilka, you were also discussing before we started the recording about just that wind tightness and air tightness makes so much sense in Western Island already. So there's that, and Helena also mentioned this idea of like, well, you can call it Passive House, you can call it something else, but it's basically like this is the way. The way to build. The specific targets might be a little bit different, but being concerned about thermal bridging, being concerned about wind tightness and air tightness, it's just you kind of got to do it there. So especially on her sites, right on the water there.
Yeah.
And there's also just these are when you have a building right on the water with these big windows and things. In order to make those work, you really need high performance components and a high performance shell. I mean, otherwise they're uncomfortable. So there's that. I mean, it's a little bit more kind of a luxury kind of building mindset a little bit, but sometimes it's just maybe your motivation is just having a really beautiful house on the water. You're going to need to address the building science.
But I think what I liked is that the materials, like all the membranes, it didn't seem like that was any kind of luxury or special component to the house. it just makes sense, because otherwise, whatever house you have, it's uncomfortable, right? So they're very diligent. Or, I mean, you need it to be watertight, and through the horizontal rain, you really have to make sure that you have your layers in place. So it seems like that those materials are just a very common building material that was already incorporated. And yeah, so from there, I think it's not such a big step anymore to go and to find competent builders to actually work with those materials and build passive houses, or to the 2030 target levels.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. And the building regulation, the base building regulations, so basically kind of code in Ireland in terms of the energy use of a building is called Part L of the building regulations. So Part L that provides, that's the genesis of that name, because those membranes are so key to that mix.
Everyone talks about Part L in that part of the world. Awesome. Great stuff, Ilka. I'm pleased that you made that contact and had that a great time over there. It does make me want to go and have a trip myself and have a look around that part of the world and meet some of the people there. But we'll put the links so people can have a look at those images and check out some of the other information that we've referenced as well. Thank you very much, Ilka. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Zach. We'll be back again next week. Passive House Live is still taking a break, but we'll be back on the Passive House podcast.